Congratulations on completing another debate. I think that this is a pretty good debate. So I'm going to give an adjudication like I did last time. I'm going to go through each speech in the debate and talk a little bit about it, and then give some feedback, and then we're going to give some general feedback about the debate if there's time left. But throughout, I'm going to be talking about strategy to take to the next debate, but also about specific arguments that you might want to think about from this debate. Either that you did make and how they could maybe be better, or that they were really good, or different arguments that could have come into the debate at particular moments. So we'll begin with Stephen, our Prime Minister. So Stephen, you begin by giving us, I think, a pretty good layout. You give us some definitions, the definition of adult. I think you have some persuasive stuff in here about how this group of 15 to 24-year-olds is responsible for, it has a lot more, even though they're only a quarter of those that are sexually active, they have half of the STIs. So I think that, then, but we kind of then go into telling us about human papillomavirus, and about the kinds of, what is bad about that, and how easy it is to prevent with certain shots. I think that this is good, but I think that what we need to hear, and you kind of get it through the debate, especially in Courtney's last speech as the opposition whip, is what specifically you're defending as a plan here. So I think this is a kind of a motion that does kind of call for at least some defense of a plan, because as Courtney will point out, as others in the debate will mention, there's a whole array of different kinds of STIs and STDs, and what are people being tested for, and how are they going to be tested for all these different kinds of diseases, and really what's the point of this program? So it's implied the point of this program is to stop the spread of these STDs, but it's never really kind of defended as a principle in a kind of clear way. And this might be something that you want to start out with. So if you start out with your principle, this is what we're defending, and then maybe give us the definitions, and then maybe give us the plan. It'll make clearer where you're going with those arguments throughout the debate. So the speech is a little short, and you're kind of taking lots of POIs. So I think you might want to think about, especially if you're the Prime Minister, what might the other team say? Right? What are some of the arguments of the other side? Maybe preemptively rebut this. This is a way to just kind of easily generate some arguments that will give you a way into the debate once you stop speaking. Because that's one of the difficult things from opening government is you speak first, but then other people will say things you don't get a chance to respond. So you want to spend all of that time that you have, or most of the time that you have, trying to make yourself relevant to the debate of what you imagine the debate to be will come. The debate to come will be. So also, your answers to some of these POIs are a little bit iffy and kind of hurt your team here. So you say, is the government going to pay for these tests? How is the government going to pay for these tests? So you say there are some free clinics, there's no problems. And then you're asked about, isn't since the status quo, you're deferring to the status quo, but this mandate is going to radically increase the number of people that are needed, that need to get STD tests. I think that this is the powerful POI, right? It's like, your policy will affect the status quo in such a way that the status quo will not be able to deal with it. But then you kind of answer and say, we're not really sure where the funding comes from. We're not really sure about, we think that the free clinics might be able to handle it. This kind of answer. And the whole, I think, also the whole opening government kind of answers this way. I think a better strategy to do here, even if you don't know, would be something like, whatever funding is possible, or whatever funding is needed for this, to get this policy through, is what we're willing to defend. So if you tell us what it is, we're willing to defend that because this policy is so important, and here's why. And then you can give us some reasons about why this policy is so important. So even if they have an idea of how much this will cost, they want to attach that figure to you, you should just accept that, even not knowing the figure, and say that you're ready to defend whatever that is. Because you don't want, I think they have a really good point here about the status quo may not be able to handle all of the people that need STD checks. So defend broadly what you need and use this as a platform for arguments about why the policy is important. Okay, so then, the leader of opposition, you start out with this, I think it's nice, kind of strategic concession, so we agree that the policy is well intended, but we're here to prove facts which defy the theory. So I think it's a nice kind of gesture, though it seems a little bit preformed. It's a little preformed to the point that we're not really sure what you're talking about. So you're saying, define the theory, and I'm not really sure if Stephen gave you a theory to defy. So I'm not really sure what you're talking about. I mean, you're reading at me at this point. So I feel a little distant from you at this moment. So just be careful about you have that nice gesture that you want to make, and even if you keep it in mind and you have prepared it ahead of time, you want to adapt it to what has happened. So I think that the first argument about the celibate religious is really interesting. It's a really fascinating argument, and I want to just hear more of a principled basis for it. So while it is, I think you probably had most of the audience in agreement with you that it would seem like a violation to those, especially those that are living a life apart, or in some ways apart from certain kinds of social expectations about sexuality and sexual activity, because they have taken religious vows. That this would be a kind of a violation to invite them in. But I think I want to hear more of a principle about, like, this is an example of a larger principle that's being defined for citizens throughout the world, because they are somewhat of a small segment of society, potentially. And you still could have the government kind of get up and say, without totally destroying their case, well, we would make an exception for the religious people. They don't do this. They could, and it might not be the strongest strategy. It would be better if this had come out right away. And that's probably not the best strategy anyway. But it's still kind of small, even though it's very persuasive. So it's very persuasive. You're winning the argument, but you need to make the argument bigger in order to have the argument that you're winning at the end, when it's being adjudicated, become an important argument. So this is an example of that kind of magnitude. The magnitude of the argument needs to be greater, even though you're winning the argument at this point. The argument's too small. So then you make this argument about the educated population and say, well, the educated population, they're smart enough to know the risks. Then you get a POI. I think it's really good. If the risks are known, why is the rate increasing? And then you have the gesture. And we talked about this in class. You say, I'll answer it later. You can't do this. Especially when you have a POI that's really good, actually. When you have a really good POI, you would need to answer it right away. Otherwise, it's kind of like, it might linger in the mind of the judge who's still thinking about it, like, you're going to answer it when? Because now your argument is like falling away from me. So you want to answer really good POIs, especially immediately. And I don't really know that you ever do answer it, which makes it even worse. Because though you're saying that the people are educated enough to know, you also kind of make this argument later on, which is that all that we get from testing is statistics. So you make two assumptions here in this argument. One is that primarily what the policy is doing is going to publish kind of national statistics that will give us a general sense of, like, the state of affairs in the entire nation. But as you've already pointed out with your CDC statistics, this kind of already exists. So it's non-unique, as we will say in the policy debate lingo. It's non-unique to the plan, right? It's like it exists in the status quo, that there's a general information about how many people have STDs in the country. Because it can be done with statistical samples. It doesn't need every single person there. So you have a general knowledge of this. And that's not part of the plan either. But I think the weakness of this argument is more that you're missing what is the implied part of their program. And closing government will do a really good job of kind of making this even a stronger point, which is that actually, if not everyone does know that they're infected. And once someone does know that they're infected, they are far less likely to engage in risky sexual behaviors. And then we have, like, other arguments that come out from this, like, and also it'll be easier to prosecute people, and people will be aware of kind of the evidence that exists in the system that will make them, even if they were the kind of people that would knowingly do this, make them less likely. So it kind of get on both points. And because you're talking about all we're getting is statistics from this, you're kind of missing out on what the point of the argument is. So I think that this goes back to the POI that you didn't answer, because it seems in some ways that what is happening with the mandatory tests is a kind of way of educating the populace about something that people do not want to be educated about. That the education system can't tell you about, do you have an STD? You need a kind of test for this. So I think that the point of clash here is missed. Even though later, I think the argument about better sex ed education has its place. You're missing the argument here. You're missing the clash when you answer the POI in this particular way by delaying it and then talking about all we're getting is statistics. So another thing that you do, this is a strategic and stylistic kind of problem, which is that you ask a lot of questions. You say, so are you going to give people treatment? Are you going to give them support groups? Are you going to do this? Are you going to do this? Are you going to do this? And the rhetorical question is less effective when someone can get up and say, as your opponent, say yes, right? So you want to use the rhetorical question in a place where you're very certain, or you're close to certain, that your audience will know exactly what the answer is, and that your opponents, won't be able to say anything different than what your audience would say. So it's something that you should use sparingly. I think in general, as a general rule of thumb, use the rhetorical question more sparingly than you do, because you use it throughout. And also, even more important than this is that it gives away opportunities to make arguments. You're saying, because people don't get support groups, this is what will happen. And so we would get more of an impact if you framed it as a statement. So rather than saying, well, we give them support groups, and it pushes the burden back to the other side, say, clearly the government will not give them support groups, and this is what the world will look like after that. These are the kind of impacts that come from that. So questions don't have as much impact, both as rhetorical effectivity and also in the lingo of debate as like, what's the world look like under the plan? So we don't hear the impacts with the rhetorical question, and that's a problem that you can fix easily. So I think you have the beginning of a nice argument here right at the end of your speech about how those who contested and can still lie to partners, and that because people are, but even more interestingly, people who are mandated to get this will not kind of take the precautions in between testing periods. So this seems to be what you're getting at, but you don't quite formulate it that way. You kind of say that people will kind of use it to be devious. And I think that the stronger argument is that there is a window here, no matter how strict the policy is, and they haven't defined what the testing period will be, and it ends up becoming a year throughout the debate. But no matter what this window is, there's going to be a time when people are not tested, and you can develop an STI during this time. And I think that this is a place where you can make an important argument about being like, now because we've put the responsibility away from the individual, this creates a kind of attitude towards STIs that as long as people are filling their kind of mandatory bureaucratic duty of going to get their regular STI check, that they're safe. And this kind of affords them a legal status that is not necessarily reflected in their actual health status. And this creates problems. And this could be also a rebuttal to the kind of criminal, that didn't come up in the debate yet, kind of the criminal prosecutorial thing, which is like, well, what about the point when someone can use it as evidence for not being guilty of sexual assault when they transmit someone an STD? Because like, well, the last time I got checked, I was clean, right? And like, there's registered. So we have, I think it could be like made a little bit more broader, especially if we don't assume that people's motivations, that the most important kind of group of people are the devious people. If you can kind of give us, what are the effects on like the most average person? Since everyone's mandated to do this, this would be a bigger impact, right? Rather than this, I imagine that the people that are like truly devious are a smaller segment of society than the people that maybe are somewhat lazy and kind of accept going just once a year, and that this is enough for knowing that their sexual health is a-okay. So I think more could be developed there. Okay, Deputy Prime Motion. Don't read the motion. Okay, I like that you begin and say, our goal is this, to prevent the spread of diseases and that endangers a community, not embarrassing people. This is really good. I think Stephen should say it. So, if this means that Dylan should go first, whatever, but you should come out with your principle right away in the first speech. But I think it's good that you say it. And I think the way that you signal your arguments is like perfect, right? You're like, first I'm going to explain to you why the non-mandatory system doesn't work. And then I'm going to show you how the mandates will do these things that didn't work in the previous system, right? You don't quite deliver on that, but that's exactly what's needed at the particular moment, right? That's exactly what's needed. But you have really good arguments, too, under some of this stuff. I think the health insurance argument is really fascinating. However, you develop a lot of it that is an argument against you. And then you're talking about how, like, premiums are reasons that people might not get tested. And that now that we're doing this kind of whole, and you get the POI, now that everyone's doing this, like, wouldn't this affect people that have premiums? And you make an interesting argument in response, which is, now that people will fear losing the premiums because they have to go, they'll engage in less risky sexual behavior. And I think that this is a really interesting and good argument. I think that there's a kind of finessing that you need to do here with the argument to make it a little bit more plausible and a little bit more important, right? So maybe talking about what is the person who's making a decision? We don't really hear anything about this in the debate. Someone who engages in what we might call risky sexual behavior. What does this moment look like? And what kinds of things are taken into consideration? And maybe like through an analysis of this, you could get a better sense of why something like losing health insurance, as opposed to The other kinds of obvious concerns, like contracting an STI or pregnancy or something like this, will actually be more present in someone's mind than these other kinds of risks are. Why is this risk of losing insurance going to be the one that deters someone from risky sexual behavior? If you can prove that, or if you can at least if you can make a persuasive argument for that, this will become an important argument in the debate. So something to keep in mind is that kind of moment of decision of the person that you're talking about. Good, yeah, you have really good responses to the POIs, though the response to the POI about rape is I don't have anything, actually. So I think that I'm kind of surprised that after the POI was made, I think by closing opposition, that this doesn't become a larger issue in the debate, because I think it could be a very important issue in the debate. And so you kind of get away with having maybe you didn't get away with it. I don't know. The judges didn't, just gave you the 4. But I think you kind of get away in the debate with not answering this POI because it's never made it into a substantial argument in the debate. But it could have been, right? Someone could have said, opening government didn't answer this POI. And precisely for that reason, that shows that they don't have anything to say about this. But this is the most important argument in the debate. This would be a nice way to start an extension, for instance, if you're closing opposition, right? Here's our extension. They didn't answer this POI. They don't have anything to say about this. This is the most important issue in the debate. So be careful of someone might be trying to get in their extension with a POI and you don't want to not have an answer to it, because then they can use that as evidence against you when they introduce their extension. So that's also kind of a note to be be careful which team you're taking your POIs from. Those are different, those mean different things. Advanced debate tactics, 101. Okay, the deputy leader of the opposition. So we're talking about the slippery slope thing. Okay, a couple important things. This is important for everyone. You're appealing a lot to precedent in the United States Supreme Court system. And I think that's interesting. But one thing that should be taken into account, and this is, maybe we should have talked about this more before we began the debate, is that we are not necessarily trying to pass a law that is constitutional. We're trying to pass a law that is good. And it may be an assumption of many of your judges that laws that are constitutional are good, but it's not necessarily something you should always assume, right? There might be a reason that we would want a law, even if the current opinion of the Supreme Court justices today might think that it's unconstitutional based on all these kinds of complicated precedents that you can bring up. So while this is a way that a lot of American political discourse goes based on our kind of weird common law system and our constitutionality, which I think is great. But I don't think that it necessarily deals with the clashes in the debate. So it's not something that, I'm not saying it's an argument they should never make, but you're talking as fakely as legislators. Like, you're trying to think about making a law, rather than whether something, so in this kind of case, making a law kind of implies that it's legal, right? If we're making the law, it has a kind of legality. Even though so a better way to make these kinds of arguments might be to say, well, there's a principle, and we can see it in the Constitution, right? But the principle of the Constitution is this, and this is why it's such an important principle. Here are the concrete impacts that come from violating this principle, which is in the Constitution or which is in certain kinds of court cases, and we see that this law will do it. And I think by doing that, rather than saying there is such a precedent and therefore we can't do it, will be I think a better kind of argument. So then your stuff about race, which you get a lot of credit for from the judges, I don't see it connecting very clearly to the policy, right? So I think you kind of get away here with animation of the argument, but the link is weak for me. So you say that there are the STDs are disproportionately affecting minority communities. And to me, this seems like something, very clearly the government could say, yeah, precisely, which is why we should pass this kind of policy, because, there is unequal access to clinics that test for health in these communities, or whatever they want to say. And this is part of the reason why there's a disproportionate effect of minority communities. But you're kind of seeming to say that, because again, you're assuming something about the statistics, that this will embarrass minority communities further, which is also seems strange to me, because the evidence that you're supplying for this argument seems to be the thing that you're arguing against, right? Look at these statistics. By doing the policy, we'll have these statistics. It seems weird to me. I don't get it. But you seem, the animation of your speech is good, but it doesn't make argumentative sense to me. I might be wrong on that, but I don't quite get it. Hopefully that's clear about why I don't think there's a link there. Yeah, and you get a POI about this. If all adults are tested, how is this discriminatory? And you say, and these are facts, and they're shared with everyone, which is not necessarily true. We don't hear anything about this in the plan. This is something that you've assumed ahead of time. And you say that they're shared with everyone. And again, this is also true of the CDC facts that you're using for the argument. So it's, you get away with it. You get away with it because but I think that in a different debate, it would be very likely that you could be slammed for this point, and you could lose the debate. So be careful. You could lose the debate just on this kind of argument. So be careful. Okay, so member of government. So I think this idea about those people with incurable STDs is interesting, but you just kind of give it as a fact, and you're like, this is a fact, keep it in mind, and let me go do my rebuttal. I think what you should do instead is say, this is the fact about how many people have incurable diseases, and here is like, right away, here's the reason that this is such an important part of the debate that hasn't been mentioned. Here's the argument. So just giving us the facts is not really clear what that means. And as the opposition will go on to say, if it's incurable, then what do these tests do? I mean, these tests aren't going to cure the people that are affected by them. And the response ends up being pretty good, which is like, yes, but these people will end up being aware and therefore won't pass it on to partners. But then it's not really clear why it's so important that they're incurable as opposed to curable. That seems to apply for all people infected with STIs. So why is this fact important? Why is it important that it hasn't been mentioned in the debate? You need to tell us. It's your responsibility. The audience might be interested in it now, but they're not sure why necessarily. It could go in a bunch of different directions. So do the work for the audience and with this important fact. The rebuttal here is really good. You do a lot of good rebuttal about the costs are already there. We're already spending a lot on treatment, that we would be spending less, so it would be a trade-off with treatment, I think is the argument you're making, because of the cost of new AIDS cases, $6.5 billion, a big number. The answer to the POIs, again, we have this problem of, I'll get there. But I still think that the rebuttal is pretty good. I think that this argument about universities is kind of interesting. You're like, there's so many of the people that are infected with STIs are on university campuses that we should default to the system that already exists on university campuses. But I'm not. Quite personally, I'm not really sure I buy this argument, though I find it interesting because I'm like, well, what is this system that exists on universities? You seem to assume that the audience knows about it and are aware of how it functions, but I'm not aware of it. So I think you need to do more and be like, let's look at what's the population of people is that have STIs. This chunk are people that are university students. So let's look at what their lives will look like. They are on university campuses, and here are the kind of concrete things that exist all over in different universities to help them deal with STIs, right? So it's like now that you're getting and you could do this with all the different segments of people that have STIs, and by giving us this, you're like, look, we don't need a new, to radically revamp and pay a lot of money to do this policy. This is actually just going to be a legislative action. The infrastructure already exists there to do this. I think this could be very persuasive, but it's kind of signaled rather than developed as an argument for each of these folks. And then the Medicare-Medicaid argument where you're saying, we're already paying for these people's treatments. Also, by the way, be careful of these people's. It's a kind of distancing language that's often used. And just, often it just means these people, these other people. But sometimes it sounds kind of dismissive. And it comes into debates a lot, but it's something to be aware of. These people sounds dismissive. We're already paying for these people's treatment. It isn't clear why it is an argument for the other side, right? Because it's like, well, if we're already paying for their treatment, why would we want to pay more for the test? This might be what your audience thinks, because maybe they're not following this kind of idea of okay, well, the infrastructure is already in place. Or this would trade off with the kind of treatment plan if we had more preventative care. But you need to make the argument, right? So you need to do this work so the audience is following you the whole way. And you just say prevention, not treatment, but you need to show that this is a cost argument, that we will pay less. We will pay less if we work on prevention than on treatment, because we're in the status quo. We're already paying a lot for treatment. I think that you just kind of saying this would be saying this clearly and then giving your arguments in that order, rather than saying after you make the point about Medicare and Medicaid, would make the Medicare Medicaid point more clear. Okay, then you have some really interesting arguments about freedom, and I kind of am wondering why it's in the middle of the speech, not at the top, because this seems to be kind of your extension. So we have to wear a seatbelt. Limitations on free speech. selective service. These are all examples of imminent danger, and you kind of cite the court case, the imminent dangers that a kind of civil society faces that allow there to be restrictions on their political rights. And you have this kind of difference, you have this nice kind of rhetorical parallelism, like if we're willing to fight external wars, wouldn't we be willing to fight the internal biological wars? Which is interesting, right? I like this. But I'm not sure that I follow and see what, it seems like a defensive extension, right? Because you're like, we're not taking away freedom. But what are you doing? What are you doing? And maybe it's something more like what you're talking about with taking away, when we take away something like fertility or health, all the things that STDs do. This would be a crime if it was done by a non-biological agent, if it was done by a human agent. This seems to be your point. And that thus, since we have the measures to prevent these things, it's as if we're allowing crimes to go on in our society by not passing this plan. I think that this could be an extension. If you could kind of develop this as a kind of principle of the difference, maybe one way to go would be like the difference between how we conceive of biological or natural agents and human agents, even when they have the same effects, leads us to kind of bad policies. And so we should conceive of bacterial infections like gonorrhea to be the same as someone like doing it, the same as a person taking away or producing these effects on someone's body, since it's preventable, since we can test for it. And therefore, we should make policy under this kind of idea that things that are crimes when humans do them, if biological agents do them, and we have the policies to stop them, it would be a crime if the state did not implement a policy to deal with it. This would be a really interesting extension and kind of give you a ground in the debate that no one has really talked about, because no one has really laid out a strong principle in the debate, a political principle about why a good government would do this policy. And this could be one, and it's fascinating. It's a fascinating argument, but it kind of comes midway, and it's next to this it's under the stuff about freedom, and it seems to me to be even more important than the stuff about freedom, because freedom is a defense against why it's okay to take away freedoms. This seems to be the positive point about like why the state needs to act. Yeah, okay. Stuff about tests being quick, good, stays in the debate. Okay, so member of opposition. I think that I kind of like this stuff about we as Pitt students know from what our freshman seminar, though I don't know what this is, but I imagine that everyone else does, know that we need consent to examine someone's genitals, and these swabs are invasive and all this kind of stuff. Because I think that you're the first person, Oliver, to kind of bringing before the eyes energeia, as Aristotle called it, making vivid and present to us what really is involved in these tests, that they are invasive, right? They can be invasive. And I think this is a good point. I think you could kind of just follow this line. This could be your extension. To be like, these tests are invasive, they are bodily invasive, and therefore, if someone opts for them, that's okay. But you would never want to make a policy. It's against medical ethics to make mandatory invasive policies. So we have a principle in medical ethics that says if an invasive surgery is required, even if it's life-saving, the decision is with the patient. Patient agency, as it's kind of nicely oxymoronically called today. The patient agency, right? So if you have really high pain or it's life-threatening, if it's invasive, you have to be the deciding vote here. STD tests, even though you might think that they're not extremely painful, are still invasive for all these different reasons, and therefore the medical ethical principle is violated by the policy. And this violates, it violates medical practice, and it does all these kinds of bad things that flow from violating medical ethics. So I think this could be a really strong extension, rather than, some of the stuff that you say after this, I find very, very strange, and something really offensive, and I'm not really sure what you're getting at when you say that worse than raping a prostitute. This is extremely offensive, I find, and it turns me off to everything else that you say in the speech. And I think it might just be a mistake, but it's something you have to be very, very careful when you make extreme claims, especially when you're making them in kind of a scattered speech, and you're not making them precisely, because it's very dangerous. And it's also maybe a moment to reflect that even though we're simulating something in the debate, your words are still real and they have real effects. So the real effects of words are not taken away. So this is not something. This kind of provocative, weird argument should not be made in the debate. It does not help you at all. I do think that you have an interesting argument, though, about your grandmother and how this sector of people of the population, the elderly, that have lost spouses and that maybe can't even physically perform sexually. Are they part of this policy? And it might be kind of like just an oversight in the plan that people who are unable to perform sexually have to get medically tested. But even if the plan did talk about it, right? Even if the plan said, well, we would exempt these people, now they have to prove that they are sexually incompetent. It like really disrupts all of these people's lives and becomes very invasive. And this would be part of your extension about invasion, the kind of invasive practices that this policy would entail. And I think that if you made this extension much stronger, you could win the debate. That invasion of privacy seems to me to be like one of the most basic, or invasion of medical or invasive practices that violate medical ethics seems to be one of the basic low-hanging fruits in the debate, and it's an argument that no one else is really making. Your top half doesn't make it. So I think that this is something that you want to focus on. Just pick that one argument and go for it, and try to make everything part of it, rather than bringing in some arguments from before. Just go with the big argument, the extension argument. Yeah. Okay. So, government whip. I think you give a really good speech. I think it's a very good speech. So, you do a nice rebuttal. You're like, there is a great advantage to testing. It gives people knowledge. STIs are different because they endanger the lives of others. And you start talking about like the asymptomatic nature of many of these STIs. And it's nice that you put this in your rebuttal because it doesn't seem like you're introducing new argumentation. You're just like, look, this is why we need these tests. And this is a good way, for a whip to like, when it seems like an important argument hasn't been made, it's like, put it as part of your rebuttal so it doesn't seem like you're introducing new argumentation and trying to be sneaky. You're like, this is just basic kind of stuff, right? Chlamydia and HPV and certain things don't appear in some people ever, right? They're never symptomatic, but they still are transmitters of the disease. This is why testing is so important, because people make bad decisions about they're looking at their own symptoms and trying to determine whether they need to be tested, and this is not a good principle, right? So we should not trust the public to make decisions about this. Is kind of, I think, what you're getting at. Yeah, and I think that your point, you have like some really subtle points here about the elderly and why, you could just kind of like this actually wouldn't be that invasive to medical practice, because the other medical practices can kind of be incorporated alongside this, and this would just kind of expand what's already being done, with urine and blood tests for the elderly. It might be, so I think that this is interesting. It's not like super persuasive to me, but it's a nice kind of mitigating argument to some of the stuff that Oliver just brought up and was brought up by the opening opposition. Yeah, so I think that your stuff about the being the assault with a deadly weapon, right? The criminal stuff is important. It does kind of seem, this part does kind of seem to me like new argumentation, and so this is something that this could have been the extension maybe in the member speech, but it's really good. It's persuasive argumentation that the case is easier. Why, and your answer to the POI is right. It's like, obviously it's more important to prevent STDs, but since everyone has admitted that people have sexually transmitted diseases intentionally with knowing, this gives us evidence to prosecute those people and potentially deters people who want to do this from doing it, because they know that their status is in the system. So this is a really, I think, a very powerful argument. Should be in the member speech. DMV of STDs is a memorable phrase that I wrote down. DMV of STDs sounds like a really terrible place to go, but I get what you're getting at. Okay, and then opposition whip. I think that the way you begin this speech is good. When you're talking about, it's like the kind of wasted time here because we're not going to get anything comes from these different principles that it does not cure those who are incurable. It does not prevent for these kind of reasons. But I think that you kind of give this list, and it's not necessarily engaging with some of the good argumentation on the government side. Like, no, it does kind of prevent because of what, just heard Torpy say, that people now know about their condition are less likely to, they're afraid of the law, this kind of stuff, isn't engaged with, and it's kind of dismissed. And this, to me, I think this puts you lower in the debate. You have to engage with the best argumentation that comes from the other side. So I think that while the the kind of move to say what we really need is education. As it gets pointed out, I think by Torpy and a POI, it's like these are not mutually exclusive. We can have better sex ed and mandatory testing. And your way of dealing with this is a little bit waffly, and you're kind of like, well, we can, because you spend a lot of time talking about like the kind of education we need, which is new argumentation, and not really a strong development of the invasion of privacy stuff that Oliver is bringing. So you kind of like let your partner go adrift rather than like working with your partner here on developing his extension into your adjudication, your bias adjudication as the whip. So I think that you should focus more on the extension and less on this kind of education stuff. Plus, the education stuff doesn't link. It's not mutually exclusive with sex ed. I buy Torpy's argument. So I think that you got excited about something that you read, and you went with it. And I think it could have cost you the debate even more than it did. So be careful. Always use your partner's extension as the argument that you want to go for. And yeah, so that's all I have to say. So I think you guys did a good job. This was a good debate. I think everyone did a good job. So general things to focus on are taking fewer POIs and making better ones. Making sure that you respond, especially to the best POIs right away. And making sure that, especially if you are in the top side of the house, if you're in the top side of the house, making sure that you develop a strong team line, and if you're in the bottom side of the house, making sure that your extension is clear and that the whip uses the extension, right? So it's the kind of clarity of what the team is about, and developing that team line is something that everyone needs to work on. Good job, and I look forward to seeing another good debate next week.